begin with the trigger warning. There are many more types of universalism than Christian universalism, but Christian universalism is what I'm talking about today. Generally, Christian universalism is what our universalist tradition grew out of. I recently discovered a personal connection between me and that tradition. The history of Christian universalism shows us a great deal about our universalism. It explains why the Universalist Church went from being the 9th largest denomination in the US to being so financially broken down in the mid-20th century that merger with the Unitarians seemed wise. It explains why Universal went from being bitterly scandalous in the 1800s to being pretty much non-controversial in our time. It also explains a lot of the theological misery our Montgomery County neighbors go through. If Christianity presses your buttons, you've been warned. Now, my father told me that one of our ancestors or a great uncle was named Almond Strain, and that he had been a preacher, and that he had written a religious book. I've been looking for that book for years, and I haven't found it yet. I learned, though, just before the coronavirus hit, that instead of being a religious conservative, a Baptist or Campbellite or a disciple of Christ, that he was a universalist. He and his relatives supplied tiny universalist churches in and near Bell County, Texas. Now, Bell County in the late 1800s. Now, Bell County is in central Texas near Fort Hood, Killeen, and Temple. Now, this makes sense. They were the ancestors of my father's father, who died when I was very young. I appear to resemble him physically and temperamentally. He wanted to be a criminal defense lawyer like I am, but my grandmother thought there would be no money in it. For the great bulk of his life, I understand that he was a deist, someone who believed that God started nature at creation, but didn't involve himself in its operations afterwards. Such a person would not believe in the efficacy of prayer and would not believe in any kind of supernaturalism. What life was like for most of our ancestors, using late 1800s Bell County, Texas, as an example. This was the time before radio, before recorded music. Motion pictures and motor cars were urban rarities. Rural telephone service generally did not exist, nor rural electrical service. The farms had, to a very great extent, housed lives of lonely physical drudgery. Farms and ranches were far from each other. Visitors were rare. Social life was made up of market Saturdays, church on Sundays, and rare days of business in town. There were no electric lights, stumbling around in the dark for morning chores, having to preserve milk with expensive, stored, insulated ice. No mechanized farm equipment, plowing the land with horses or mules, harvesting by hand, often needing to hire help at harvest time. But the difficulties of the life of the male farmer were nothing compared to the difficulties that women faced. No electricity meant no running water. Every drop had to be carried from a pump or a well, and water is very heavy. My mother's mother, who was blessed to live in a country town instead of a farm, was once asked what the greatest technological improvement in her life had been. She said that it was the kitchen sink. Now, on top of that, problem with the water, washing was done in large pots of boiling water, swished around with paddles as big as oars. And you had to take the wrinkles out with what were called sad irons, big pieces of iron that you put on a stove. And of course, it got terribly hot. And sometimes the soot would get on the irons, and then they'd iron the clothes, and then soot would show up on the shirt or blouse or whatever it is, which meant you had to wash the whole thing over if you wanted it clean. Cooking was done on iron stoves, the same iron stove, In a Texas summer, it would turn any kitchen into a sweat box from hell. Some crops only had a few days in the year in which they could be canned. When the harvest came, you had to can them immediately. This process required women to work with boiling water and giant cooking pots throughout the entire day in the summer. If the woman was sick, that was too bad, because otherwise the crop would be lost, or a big part of it. For a woman to stay healthy out in the country in those days was practically impossible. No birth control. Married women were pregnant just about every time they could be. Home births, unattended by doctors, were common. Women often suffered birth injuries that just were never treated. There was a common saying back then: Texas is hell on horses and women. I don't want to minimize the persistent unfairness and threats of lynching against Blacks, Indians, and other people of color. Homosexuality back then was the love that dare not speak its name and was punished with long prison sentences. In that barren world, where the only evening entertainment was likely reading a book by a lantern, church singing was just about the only socially acceptable public expression of emotion that there was. This is why they sang so much, and why the song tradition in the 19th century was so strong. He was also strong before that. Now, Universalists generally believed in bringing people in, not shutting people out. They were coalition builders. They were working people generally. They were democratic rather than aristocratic. No other denomination at that time in America had so many women clergy. Practically all other denominations had none. Now, to understand where this universalism fit in relationship to everything else, it helps to know the Calvinist backdrop of ordinary religion. Much religion in America in the 1800s was either Calvinist or it was some kind of reaction to Calvinism. Calvinism held that people were totally depraved, totally evil. It held that God chose some to be saved, but most were to be damned for all eternity. Furthermore, Jesus only died to save those who God had chosen to save. Those who God chose to save could not resist having been chosen. And once God chose people, those people would stay chosen. Calvinists in those days did not seem to me to be like fun people. They were given to sermon topics like sinners in the hands of an angry God, which compared a typical sinner to a spider held over an abyss by a thread. Now, Universalists rejected the idea that Jesus only died to save those who God had already chosen. They argued instead that Christ's sacrifice would, in the end, save everybody. Universalism back in those days was novel and very appealing. Ordinary Christianity had preached an eternal hell of torture for non-believers for centuries, although there were some ancient church fathers who had been Universalists, like Origen. Universalism was much more, fun than Calvinism. It was more joyous. It was logically appealing too. Okay, God's supposed to be love, and the idea is that he's dooming millions to eternal torture just because no missionary had reached them. I always imagined some missionary going in the town whose horse got lame, and the old person died in the village, and so that person went to hell for all eternity because the horse went lame. What has happened since the 1800s and now is something that would have been thought inconceivable then. Theologians changed their minds. Now, even some old-time universalists like Murray and Hosea Ballou believed in a purgatory instead of a hell. In the afterlife, bad people might suffer for a very long time, even maybe thousands of years, but after that, they would wise up and accept salvation. Eternal justice, even in the afterlife, does not require an absolute eternity of torment. Some theologians and denominations tacitly, quietly adopted that universalist view. Some other theologians said it wasn't clear that all would be saved, but it might be true, and they hoped so. Conservative theologians and denomination adopt the views that the souls of evil people in hell eventually are destroyed. The rest of Christianity couldn't beat the universalists. So the rest of Christianity adopted universalist theology. And they have, in the main, gotten rid of their eternal torment sermonizing that, as a practical matter, was very successful marketing for universalist churches. Most churches today don't want to advertise, or in some cases even admit, that they are actually or potentially or secretly universalist. There were lots of reasons why people rejected Calvinism, but I think that probably the one that made most sense to me was that the burden of living in a universe that has everlasting torment has got to be hard on a person. Now, some of our conservative neighbors belong to churches that are universalists without their knowing it. Those of our neighbors think practically everybody is damned. They're afraid that they're damned. Some fear that they could lose their salvation somehow and would be doomed to actual eternal suffering. My experience is that this faith does not make them cheerful and joyful. It tends to make them frightened and sour. Now, some people who believe that practically everybody but their little group is eternally damned, some of them become snobs. Some of them look down on people with less money than they have, and a non-trivial number of them are racist. It's not surprising that they may be little interested in decision-making by consensus, by discussion, by majority vote. Their religion is part of what makes them dangerous. It also means that they deserve our pity. Ain't that good news? There is a spiritual called Good News. I heard it from the a cappella group Sweet Honey in the Rock, led by civil rights activist, musician, and scholar Bernice Johnson Reagan. I heard it on a recording that was made at All Souls Unitarian Church in Washington, D.C. 41 years ago. It goes like, I've got a robe into that kingdom. Ain't that good news? I've got a robe into that kingdom. Ain't that good news? I'm going to lay down the world. I'm going to shoulder up my cross. Gonna go home to my Jesus. Ain't that good news? Reagan, funny name, emphasized that what she wanted to leave her audience that night was not a historical note that Black folks sang about going to heaven. She wanted them to remember that the truth that people are created free and equal, and that they are good, and that they come into the world without sin, that is good news. She said that the path of righteousness, the path of right action, didn't promise good times, but it was good news. The path of righteousness might bring you hard times, conflict, trouble. But everyone, good trouble, maybe it should be said, but each one of us is called to be on that path of righteousness and holiness. And the truth of universal salvation is very good news.